Greetings, greetings, Facebook Live. Welcome to the discussion, Ferguson 5 years later. I am Shaba Kojo. I'll be hosting this discussion. We are working in conjunction tonight with Black Awakening Movement. So hopefully some of the Black Awakening Movement group will start joining in. Go ahead and start joining in. Welcome, Rhonda. Rhonda just joined. Hello there. So the Black Awakening Movement is officially in the house. Hopefully we'll have the rest of the crew come on. As you all know by now, Black Awakening Movement centered around awakening the people with information and events. We hold a live call. It used to be conference call, but we're moving over into the Facebook Live platform Thursdays at 7 p.m. weekly. And we discuss current issues, past issues. Sometimes we hold classes and discussions like this one. I am Shaba Kojo. I am a co-founder of Shoolay. Haven't been on much with Black Awakening Movement recently because I've been so busy with Shoolay and setting up classes for mainly teenagers, young adults, and even adults in the South Florida area, which is where Black Awakening Movement got its start. It's where we met with Rhonda here and really got that platform going. And, you know, being I believe it was chief advisor of Black Awakening Movement, Rhonda, and still being active with that group, but haven't been as active as I used to be. So it's not that the work has stopped, the work continues. Shoolay now is dedicating time and energy to educating children, primarily with the African narrative. So we've set up, there we are, Rhonda said yes. We've set up a 501c3 so that we could start going after funding, start going after contributions, because I don't think that the children should have to pay to receive education, enrichment programs, anything having to do with being African-centered or the Al-Kebalan narrative. I don't think they should have to pay for that. I think the people who took their culture from them should be the people to foot the bills. And, you know, those people have a structure set up. We've got to go through certain channels to get the funding. So I'll see what that's like. I personally hate the nonprofit world. I hate the 501c3 world. It's just that my co-creator, she says, well, you got to stop paying for this stuff out of your own pocket. You know, there are channels to get money so that we can be more effective with the community by getting funders and bringing people together who I believe owe that great service to the children. Welcome, Michelle, joining in. Thank you for joining in. We're going to give everyone some time to join in. I'm sporting the MAGA hat today, the Make Al-Kebalan Great Again, Make Africa Great Again. These are definitely going to be up for sale. This is the prototype that I'm wearing now, but orders are already coming in. This is the new era, the 5950 style. We're also going to be doing snapbacks. A lot of people have been asking for red to kind of do that, that parody on what Trump got going on. But that's not why we're doing this. We're doing this to represent us. So we want to separate from him and his branding. We don't want to do a parody on that. But this, as you can see, if I'm rocking it, it's got to be tight. So that's the housekeeping. Definitely subscribe to Shoolay, follow Shoolay, go to shoolay.com. That's SHOOLAY.com. We're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, we're on YouTube, we're on LinkedIn, we're on Twitter, we're on all the platforms. But go to the website, sign up, join our mailing list as we begin to bring this information to the children. But tonight, I took 5 minutes to do that while people continue to join in. Tonight, we're going to be discussing something very particular. So I'm going to be removing this branding. Got the do-rag under there. You know, we do it. And we're putting on to St. Louis tonight, because tonight, or this evening rather, we're doing Ferguson 5 years later. The question that I've been getting a lot is, why do violent police interactions keep occurring? Why do we keep being gunned down by the police, even as we are unarmed, even as we are in flight for our lives? I had some surveys up here. I'm not quite sure if those get to go out. I don't know how that works, but the survey questions were, are our interactions with the police getting any better, or have they gotten any better since Ferguson? And that was a yes or no. So if you guys want to chime in and answer yes or no to that. I don't know how the live surveys work, and I don't want to mess around with this mouse right now. But have police interactions gotten any better since Ferguson? And why Ferguson? Why Mike Brown? Why Darren Wilson? Well, that was at the time the most broadcast incident of police brutality for this current generation. We're still trapped in the Ferguson paradigm, in my opinion. Of course, you know, that was coming off the tail end of Trayvon Martin, and then we got to feel that double trauma of a citizen vigilante gunning down an African descent child. And then we got the reinforcement in Ferguson with law enforcement doing the same thing. And of course, those are just two cases of the many that were going on at that time. I don't want to minimize the other issues and the other police overreaches, the other police murders that were occurring at the time. But we're going to concentrate on Ferguson. And why do we keep having these negative interactions with the police? Let's see. Okay, good. So we have the watch party from the Black Awakening movement. So if you're tuning into the Black Awakening movement site, yes, this is, you know, we're doing it from the Shoolay this evening as I try to continue to launch this platform. So Baba Khalil has went ahead and launched the watch party from the Black Awakening movement group, and that should bring you all into this live discussion, which is, again, combination of Shoolay and Black Awakening movement. So the question out on the board was, do you think police interactions have gotten any better since Ferguson? I guess I'll hold my answer because people have to do the poll. But to answer the first question, which is, or rather the question that I keep getting, which is, why does this thing keep happening to us? And it has to do with sentiment. So I created an entire area of my time where I could just research, well, let's just concentrate on Ferguson. And then hopefully we can find some overarching, relating themes, if you will, as to why we keep having negative interactions with police. And rather than go off the top of my head, I like to collect stuff that I can read. Because as I learned from Mama Marimba Ani, is that Europeans tend to codify their ways of being into writing. So if it's written down, it's tangible, it's workable, it's usable. So if we are to examine the European system, we must examine the writing that they use in their system. And we all should know by now where the original police structure came from, having to deal with policing Black bodies. And, you know, we should know that that started with the slave patrols and the slave catching patrols. So, yeah, history has everything to do with it. Don't let anyone at any moment in time remove historical context from your way of thinking, being, and feeling. So the right answer is it's always related to our first interaction with this country, which is that of prisoners of war. And to many, or to a greater extent, we're still that. So let's start with the Mason-Dixon line, if we're going to really talk about it, right? So what was the Mason-Dixon line? The Mason-Dixon line was when the group of people in the South and the group of people in the North decided, well, we need to have a delineating line where we can determine what types of business are going to be allowable on the soil for the land. So they came up with the Mason-Dixon line, and that's what separated Pennsylvania, which would have been considered north, and Delaware, which would have been considered north, from Virginia and Maryland, which would have been considered south. And what was important about that is that anything north of the Mason-Dixon line would have been considered non-slaveholding states or non-enslaving states, and anything south of the Mason-Dixon line would have been considered slaveholding or enslaving states or prisoner of war states. What's interesting about the Mason-Dixon line is that we have to go back to that time to really understand it. The Mason-Dixon line didn't extend from the parallel of Pennsylvania all the way across the United States to California. Those states didn't exist at that time. So it went from where New York would be all the way to where the Mississippi River would be, because this would have been pre IT's revolution. So all of the territories west of the Mississippi River wasn't owned by what is currently the United States holdings. It wasn't owned by the British colonizers. And where's Missouri on that, right? So Missouri wouldn't come until later on. Missouri wouldn't come until after IT won their revolution, thereby forcing France to sell its territories and ceding all the land west of the Mississippi River over into the current colonies, or the British colonies, and then expanding what they were calling the United States at that time. So what used to happen is that people in the South, in places like Georgia and Tennessee and places like that, they would cross over when they wanted new land. They had a kind of cush relationship with the French, and the French, obviously, they were holding IT as an enslaving island in Louisiana and all these places. So, they didn't even call it slavery back then. They called it the business, right? So nobody was going around saying, oh, I'm into slavery. No, it's like, are you in the business? It was the business to be into if you lived in the South, because it was the business that fueled the entire economy. And of course, the raw material that was harvested in the South would then go to the North to be refined. That's where all of the work was then done on the raw material. So it fueled the entire United States economy, and to some large extent, our bodies still fuel it. You could read Michelle Alexander for that. But so people that were in the colonies that were considered the U.S. were still going over into French territory even prior to the Haitian Revolution, and they found the living there to be quite acceptable for them because it was the same system. And they weren't at war with the French. They were both taking advantage of African people, so they didn't need to be at war with one another. So as you guys go ahead to continue to keep coming in, they're telling me how Facebook Live works. So I'm starting to learn how Facebook Live works, and I'm understanding that it's not necessarily how many people tune in when you're live, but there's read broadcasts and things like that to grow the audience. So, you know, guys, continue to come in. Definitely leave comments. You can start putting questions in the comment box, and I'll try to answer those as I go through what I'm doing as well. So right now, you know, big shout out to Rhonda. Michelle is on, and I think we have one other person on, but I'm not sure who that person is. Okay, I see. Oh, I see it. It's Mama Makiba. Hey, how's it going? So go ahead and leave comments and stuff like that. For those that will be watching the video in the future, I think there is the ability to donate. And if you don't know, again, the work that I do with Shoolay is bringing information like this to children, namely from grade 6 all the way up through, you know, college, holding meetings with them in classrooms and spaces like this where we can get and break down our information primarily from that of the African narrative, from our worldview. So as we continue to look into now, Haiti wins, defeats France. France then says, I got to sell all my territory west of the Mississippi River. And guess what's included in that sale? Well, the territory called Missouri. And if you study American history, then you'll know at that point that there was something called the Missouri Compromise. What is the Missouri Compromise? Does anyone want to take a crack at it out there in some people are watching. Okay, I understand. So the people that are watching from the watch party, I'm not quite sure if they'll be able to comment. So I don't know if I would like to have as many people on as possible to be able to comment. That way we can have some interaction. So I don't know if the people in the watch party are able to comment. If you're not able to comment, it's fine to transition over to the live. You can be part of the live. I hope those are good instructions, because I want this to be as interactive as possible. So thank you for that update, Sister Rhonda. So we were talking about the Missouri Compromise, and the Missouri Compromise occurred, and of course this is Ferguson, right? 5 years later. So we all should know St. Louis is in Missouri. Ferguson is a city in St. Louis County. By the way, I neglected to mention today there were tornadoes that hit Jefferson City, Missouri. And Jefferson City had gotten hit with a bunch of tornadoes overnight, which is quite strange because I've been trying to put together this information for quite some time, and I've been going back through just how everything played out in Ferguson and trying to figure out why I was so fired up about getting all this information and compiling it together. And I got to the understanding that May is the birth month, particularly when I started doing the research, was actually the birth week of Darren Seals, King D. Seals. And it seems like, you know, the internet has completely forgotten about that young man's sacrifice. So it was very fitting for me to find that out as to why I was so fired up to get and compile all this information into something concise that I could put into a time frame and a Facebook Live. And I think it really has to do with, again, the birth month of Darren Seals. It's, we should know from the narrative and the Ferguson narrative that he was one of the main activists on the ground during the Ferguson uprising, and of course his life was cut short. And we'll speak about that some more later. So we're talking about the Missouri Compromise. So what is the Missouri Compromise? The Missouri Compromise is the United States government needed to figure out, what are we going to do with all this territory west of the Mississippi River? Is the territory going to be non-enslavement states, or is the territory going to be enslavement states? So they came up with something called the Missouri Compromise along the 3630 parallel. So the 3630 parallel is actually the line that separates Georgia, Tennessee. Let's see here. I don't want to get this information wrong. Yeah. Tennessee, that would be South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, Mississippi, right? So basically, it's territories that are considered South now, right? So that 3630 parallel, where Virginia would be above that 3630 parallel. Missouri is actually above that 3630 parallel, right? The Missouri Compromise said, well, the territories that we're going to open up west of the Mississippi River, everything below the 3630 parallel, if they're going to be admitted into the Union as a state, they can be a enslavement state. So that includes Texas, right? Missouri is above that. So it was becoming the new line for where slavery or enslavement was allowed. Everything below, they would allow enslavement. Everything above, moving west, of course. So whatever was already grandfathered in east of the Mississippi River was going to stay the way it was. It was going to use the Mason-Dixon line. Whatever was west of the Mississippi River was now going to use the new 3630 parallel that was cut out as part of the Missouri Compromise. But Missouri happens to fall above that line. So what was the compromise? The compromise was this. They were trying to bring Maine into the Union as a non-slaveholding state. And Missouri had just opened up. So Governor of Missouri said, well, we can make more money running this business, being in the business, being in enslavement than we ever could being a non-enslavement state. So if you're going to bring in Maine as a non-enslavement state, then even though Missouri is above the new line or the new demarcation line for where slavery is allowed, let's do a deal so that Missouri could be included into enslavement holding states. And that was the compromise. So they moved the line for where you could hold enslaved people south to, it would be like the tip of Texas all the way across to California, which wasn't, would come in the future. And then everything north of the line, when they would be admitted, would be non-slave holding. Everything south of the line would be slave holding, except that Missouri is above the line. But Missouri got to hold or create themselves a state that was centered around the business, that was centered around enslavement. What does that have to do with anything? What has to do with sentiment, right? So now it means that European people who classify themselves as white can and will own Africans that classify themselves or that have been classified by them as black. And that's the sentiment that still is alive and well in Missouri today. And how do we know that? Because there was a Department of Justice Ferguson report that went out. Do we remember this Ferguson report that spoke of rampant injustices throughout the entire police department as it comes to policing black bodies in Ferguson? And that report only centered on Ferguson because at the time, Mike Brown had been slain by Darren Wilson. And people were asking, why? not only why, but people were already believing that there was an over-policing problem, which we know now is, or even knew back then, at least the country knows now, is a national issue, which Africans know are a worldwide issue. But in speaking specifically to the St. Louis area, Ferguson was taken out and examined by the Department of Justice, which is the federal government. And they decided there was rampant racism, racist practices in how police the residents of Ferguson, which are mostly African descent, versus the police force, which is mostly European descent. Goes back to that same sentiment. Missouri was never considered a free state, even though this has nothing to really do with the sentiment of the entire police force, which again comes down the line of what was the creation of the police force used for. But we can specifically view it through the lens of enslavement versus non-enslavement states, because Missouri fought their way, even though they were above the new demarcation point for where you could hold people in bondage for life. They fought themselves into that through some backdoor dealing. And why do I keep harping on that point? Because it was the same kind of backdoor dealing that kept the people of African descent policed in a particularly brutal way by law enforcement in practice due to policies. So all the policies were inherently racist, even if they weren't written down, but the emails that were being exchanged in the Department of Justice investigation, the comments that were being made. Oh, you know, we're rich in this city because we know who to tax. We know who to dole out the right amount of speeding tickets to. Oh, the county coffers aren't full. Well, we need to start handing out more tickets to Black people. Oh, we need to round up some Black people to you know, spend some time in these prisons so that we can keep the budget up, right? So this was the type of come to be called locker room talk that was going on in Ferguson at the time in the open. Did that help or hurt Darren Wilson? Well, the Department of Justice report was really indifferent to the outcome of what happened with Darren Wilson. So we moved out of the Missouri Compromise. I don't see any questions on that, but we need to first discuss sentiment. Let me scroll down here. We got some other people joining in. Wow, old high school friends. How you doing over there, Javon? Hi, Mama Cheryl, how are you? Regina, new friend. I don't think we've met in person, but welcome. Thanks for joining. So we just went over the Missouri Compromise and the sentiment of what Missouri in its creation wanted to be. Missouri in its creation wanted to be a state where you could enslave Africans for your benefit. And they fought their way into being that. So now let's fast forward to this whole thing that people talk about, which is emancipation. And let's look at Missouri in this context. The jury is still out on whether or not Missouri was a Union state or a Confederate state. Half of the research that I've done says that Missouri was a Union state during the time of the Civil War. Half of the research that I've done says Missouri was a Confederate state during the Civil War. So I had to go through tons and tons of websites. I don't want y'all to think that I've bought volumes and volumes of books on this stuff. This was just meant to be a quick talk. So this is all preliminary internet research. I mean, you can find all this stuff. I always urge people to start with Wikipedia. And once you start with Wikipedia, you go down to the bottom and then there's references down there, which are the books and the volumes that you can then go into to get more information about. So Wikipedia is a good place to start to jot down all your thinking points, and then you can start branching off research from there. So Wikipedia is going to tell you more than likely that Missouri was a union state, that they never seceded, they never removed themselves from the Union during the time of the Civil War. And, you know, for people of African descent, we want to feel that that's good, that if people are on the side of the Union, you know, the Union was fighting for the freedom or the emancipation and the end of enslavement of people, and that's all cool, but that's more like, again, Wikipedia research, right? Because that's what it's going to say. But as we grow into our consciousness, we know that there is more information to get, and we can go into more details on particularly, you know, the Civil War and things like that. We have other discussions that we could have in the future on that. But Civil War wasn't about emancipating enslaved Africans as it was about business and other things. And we can have a whole other discussion on that. But let's stay on this point. So what did Missouri do during the Civil War? Well, Missouri hedged their bets. They sent delegates both to the Union and to the Confederates, because what they wanted to do was to warm up to the Confederates, because remember, they fought their way into being an enslavement holding state. But because it was done through some backdoor dealing, that means that they were real cush with the guys in Washington, right? So they sent people to Washington, D.C. during the time of the Civil War to say, oh, we're still with the Union. But at the same time, they were sending delegates to the Confederate, to the new government that has succeeded from the Union. And they were saying, well, we're warm to you too, because, you know, we're cut from the same cloth. We're doing the same thing. So what ended up happening was they actually fought physically. The Guard of Missouri fought the Union soldiers. There were battles that Union soldiers or people from the North had to fight against the Missouri State Guard. So if you're fighting the State Guard, I'm sorry, if you're using your State Guard to fight Union soldiers in Missouri, what does that say about Missouri? Where did they come down during the Civil War? Were they on the side of the Union, let's free the African people, supposedly? Or were they on the side of the Confederates, you know, the whatever you call the Confederate flag, and, you know, what side were they on? Well, it turns out that there was a tug of war in Missouri, and a group of politicians decided that they were going to go into Jefferson City, which is the same place that got hit by the tornado. That happens to be the capital of Missouri. And that they were going to deem the government of Missouri null and void and vacant, and that they were going to take over the government of Missouri. And these people that took over the government of Missouri then said, we'd like to officially secede from the Union. We want to become a Confederate state. And a Confederate state, the Confederates actually accepted Missouri as a Confederate state. So on paper and in sentiment, all that paperwork was done. They were accepted. But the Union said, well, the government that succeeded from the Union wasn't a legitimate government. So therefore, the paperwork is null and void. Why am I going into all this? Because this is all crazy paperwork, right? Well, why is the paperwork important? Because they use that same paperwork trickery, null and voidness. Is it so? Hedge their bets. They use the same thing in the grand jury after Darren Wilson gunned down Mike Brown in cold blood. They use the same legal system or grand jury system to rule that no harm, no foul. We have to get into how they did that as we move into the next section here. So we don't have a lot of people on live now, but we have any questions about that portion, Missouri Compromise, about where Missouri came down during the Civil War, hedging, being both a Union and a Confederate state, being honorarily accepted into the Confederate, but the Union not seeing that government as legitimate, even though they vacated the legitimate government. So let's get some questions and comments here. Let's talk about that for a little while before we move into our next part. Okay, hello back to you, Regina. Oh, you're in Miami, so that's awesome. Yes, Amber Phillips, indeed, 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 and Ferguson. So, as I had mentioned earlier, you know, I have on my St. Louis today, and this is specifically for the people on the ground, to pay homage to the people on the ground who really fought a good fight in trying to bring social justice to that area, even though, you know, it's responsive and it's reactionary, but it's what they were able to do. It's what the young people were able to do at that time, particularly Darren Seals and folks like that, who we know lost his life as an activist. If we know anything about Darren Seals, which again, I think is the impetus for why I'm even here tonight bringing you this information, you know, he was at odds with Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter spawned up or was created out of the same Trayvon Martin incident. And when the police shooting happened in Ferguson, Black Lives Matter, and found, according to King D, found Darren Seals and his people doing the work. But the cameras were on Black Lives Matter. So what they were doing is that they were covering Darren Seals' work and saying, okay, well, Darren Seals is doing the work of Black Lives Matter, or Black Lives Matter is doing this work. And Darren Seals took offense to that. And there was altercations between him and the people on the ground in Ferguson with Black Lives Matters. And, you know, if you were following social media at the time, you understood just how important Darren Seals was and how important he still is to social consciousness. That a lot of times organizations take off and they may lose their way, or certain segments, because organizations grow so quickly, Seals was really shining a light on that at the time that it was happening. And, you know, there was definitely foul play in his death. He was found, as you know, murdered. He was shot through the head and found in a burnt vehicle, which was odd because that same style of assassination had happened to another young Ferguson resident just a year prior. DeAndre Joshua, I believe, was that young man. He was on his way out to, I believe, visit his girlfriend the night that the verdict came back, or the grand jury decision came back not to prosecute Darren Wilson. And, you know, he went to go and see his girlfriend, according to his mother's account, and he was found shot through, as a matter of fact, not shot through the head, shot many times and put into a vehicle with lighter fluid and set on fire as well. So there was a lot of protesters, or at least 6 known individuals at that time, weren't killed all at the same time, and about 4 of those deaths were ruled suicide, even though one of them was someone hanging from a tree with their pants pulled down and folded down around their legs. Another person was said to have committed suicide on the steps of a government building in Ohio, who was also tied to the protests in Ferguson. And we'll go through those names later. But I don't see any questions coming in. Baba Khalil says everything is clear. Not enough people know about Darren Seals. Well, again, I think this whole, I want to dedicate this whole Ferguson 5 years later, not only to Mike Brown and the family of Mike Brown, but also to Darren Seals and his family as well. So Go back. I wish there was a way you could go back and capture the sentiment of what social media was like during the Trayvon Martin time and during the Mike Brown time. And of course, you know, Tamir Rice, Jordan Davis, the young man in the Walmart that was carrying around the toy gun and was gunned down by the police. And there's so many. There's so many that we tend to forget. And that's why I wanted to pause for a moment and say, let's go back to where we had shed a big floodlight on the issue, and that was particularly Ferguson. And let's bring that sentiment back as we move forward to continue to try to pull ourselves out of this situation, because nobody's going to help us through this. And that's what the second part of this talk is going to get to. Let's find out what happened. So we know what the police say. The incident started over some cigarillos. And do you think who do I think killed Darren Seals? I'm gonna say it like this. They want to make it look like it's the same people that killed DeAndre Joshua. And I don't want to go around. Let's look at it from this standpoint. Police in particular areas of the South, like Ferguson and some deep South areas that we know about, they have this quality about them that they own the place, that they own the neighborhood, that they are the warden and your neighborhood is a prison. So if you do anything in your area that they feel that they control, that's the sentiment. That's the Department of Justice said that was the sentiment of the area. So you have people in that area that are pulling attention or shining a light on what you're doing, and you're the police. You're the law. Nobody can say nothing to you. They have the power over life and death, and there's literally no accountability for them. So the police and the Klan in that area are the same people. So if you're asking me whether the police or the Klan killed him, well, the police and the Klan are the same people. So if the police killed him and the Klan killed him, then it's the same people. The feds, I don't think it was the feds. And I don't think it was the feds because, well, the feds are more concerned about what's going on in Washington than what's going on in Ferguson. So how the optics play in Washington, because the feds are ran by, my estimation, I'm going to say the feds are ran by the White House. So at the time, the optics was, you know, black president, you know. So I don't think that the feds had as much to do with it as the police and the Klan on the ground. Did the police pull the trigger? Well, the police don't have to pull the trigger. The police can put a word out that if something happens to somebody, nobody's really going to search. Nobody's really going to go looking too deeply into it. Nobody's going to do any investigation. And that's one of the tactics that police use in quelling issues in communities that they control. They don't have to go out and do the dirt. They know enough people that do dirt, and they have deals with enough people that do dirt. I'm not saying police don't do dirt on their own, because obviously they're out there killing us in the street and getting away with it. So that's televised dirt. And they do much more dirt behind the scenes, because that's only a small fraction. What we get to see on camera is only a small fraction of the dirt that police are responsible for. But police also head street gangs that they get to do dirt for them. So whether it was the police or the Klan, my opinion is that the police were involved, and the police being the Klan in that area, the police and the Klan were involved. Whether or not they pulled the trigger is something I cannot answer. But this whole conversation is on sentiment. And the sentiment of that area is that European police own black bodies. So they'll be damned if black bodies are going to disrespect them and have riots in their communities. You know, law and order. Law and order. You know, that's what they're about in those areas. Law and order. Welcome, Angela. Welcome, Angela. So we're moving into part 2 now. Why all the talk about all the stuff, the backdoor dealing with the Missouri Compromise, sentiment with, you know, moving the Mason-Dixon line, and whether or not Missouri was a Confederate state or a Union state? Well, it has to do with how things are written on paper. So we spoke about the cigarillos, and then, you know, Mike Brown, as the news would have it and report to us, half of his body was in the car. That's where Darren Wilson says a struggle ensued. That's where Darren Wilson says, you know, he felt like a child in the hands of Hulk Hogan. Do you remember that quote? I don't have the police report in front of me. I don't know if he says Mike Brown reached for the gun or not. That's irrelevant. What ended up happening was Mike Brown wrestles himself free away from Darren Wilson, turns, and begins to take off in the other direction. He's running, and he is clearly unarmed. No gun inside, no gun mentioned, no arms mentioned in the police report would have been in the hands of Mike Brown. So in the hands of Mike Brown. So at the time that Darren Wilson shoots to kill several shots towards Mike Brown, he knows that Mike Brown is unarmed. Mike Brown is fatally shot. He bleeds out on the street in front of many eyewitnesses, which is what turned that community upside down. You know, he goes the route of Zimmerman, goes straight to the hospital, takes some pictures with some minor, and says this was a fight for his life. Whether or not, when Mike Brown was in the car, halfway in the car, I can tell you what I think. I think he dragged Mike Brown into the car. But, you know, that's not the way he told the story. The way he told the story is that Mike Brown went into the car to do fisticuffs in his face and all that. The point is, by the time Mike Brown turns to run, Darren Wilson is no longer in any danger of losing his life. And he knows that Mike Brown is unarmed. And he decides he's going to execute him on the street. This comes back to sentiment. So let's go into more of the writing. What is a grand jury supposed to do now? A grand jury, and remember, the jury stuff happens, I don't remember, the Department of Justice report came out before all this grand jury stuff, is in my recollection. A grand jury is called together by a prosecutor, a state or local prosecutor. In this case, it's a state prosecutor. And in this case, the prosecutor has a name, Kathy Alizadeh. Alizadeh. Grand juries exist for one thing, and that is to view the evidence, which is very minimal evidence, that the state attorney or the state prosecutor has on a person suspected of committing a crime, and then deciding whether or not they should pursue charges against the person. Is my hat straight? So they are brought together at the request, or rather, they were a prevention mechanism from state attorneys being overzealous and just charging people with crimes in secret and then bringing them into the court and saying, well, we've charged you with a crime. So another step had to occur where a group of people had to get together and say, we've got to rein in the state or the federal or the local prosecutor, and we've got to have at least some oversight to see what evidence the state attorney is using to charge someone with a crime. And it's got to at least meet the minimum burden of evidence. So they're able to look at the state's case. So really, the grand jury is supposed to be trying to figure out if the state attorney has enough evidence to charge someone with a crime. The state attorney, they don't even want a grand jury, because the state attorney's job is to charge people with crimes. That's what you are. You are the prosecutor. Your job doesn't exist if you don't have anyone to prosecute. So your job as the state prosecutor is to form cases against people. And you don't want a grand jury, because you don't want to convince a grand jury that you should be able to charge someone with a crime, because as a state prosecutor, that's what you want to do. Your job exists to charge people in your jurisdiction with crimes. That's what you do. But that's not the way it worked out in the Darren Wilson case. So clearly, an unarmed young black man was shot and killed. And the city, which is mostly African-American people, says a crime has been committed. Our tax dollars should indicate that we live in this city, and we pay the prosecutor to prosecute cases where crimes have been committed. And the prosecutor should say, look at the evidence and say, well, Mike Brown was unarmed, Mike Brown was running. Whether a fight ensued in the car or not is not relevant here, because he was fleeing. So therefore, Darren Wilson was not in danger of his life anymore. So is this police overreach? And the state prosecutor should say, well, it looks like a crime to me because he shot somebody that was running in the back. And the state prosecutor is supposed to go to the grand jury and say, well, what is the video? Doesn't it look like he shot somebody in the back? We should charge him with something. But that's not the way it worked out in Ferguson. The way it worked out in Ferguson, it seemed like from the very onset, the grand jury was on the side of the defense. And that's why there's over 2,000 or 3,000 pages of grand jury court documents, and I have some of them here. This is what I do. This is what I do in my spare time, right? So let's take a look at what the grand jury did when they called the Darren Wilson case before the grand jury. It says, so this is the state prosecutor, Alizade, looking at the grand jury, and she has in her hand a statute. And she says, I'm going to pass out to all of you. This is September 16th, by the way. September 16th, 2014. She says, I'm going to pass out to you, and you are going to receive a copy of a statute. It is section 563046, and it says, law enforcement officers' use of force in making an arrest. And it is the law on what is permissible, what force is permissible, and when in making an arrest by police officers, I also want to point out to you, I know you have probably heard, or you know, that there's also a joint federal investigation that's going on at the same time. And several of our witnesses, you're going to hear from them. First of all, there aren't supposed to be any witnesses in grand juries. It's supposed to be, do you have paper evidence? And certainly there aren't supposed to be any witnesses for the defense. If there are going to be witnesses, I might have misspoke. Maybe there are going to be witnesses. What I meant to say is there aren't supposed to be any witnesses for the defense. Grand juries happen without the knowledge of the defense. The defense shouldn't even be known that they shouldn't even know that they're going to be charged with a crime. So the prosecutor gets the prosecution team set up, and they put together a case. And because there has to be some oversight, that's why a grand jury exists, so that they can say, look here, there are some people that you have to agree with us so that we could charge this person with a crime. It's not supposed to be the prosecutor saying, well, I got to find out how, I got to find a way to make the grand jury not charge a person with a crime, which is what happened in the Ferguson case. So firstly, Darren Wilson got to testify in his own defense. There is no defense in a grand jury because the grand jury is trying to decide whether or not a crime has been committed. So you're not defending yourself against a crime, but he got to testify in his own defense at a grand jury hearing. Odd. The statute that she hands them, 563-046, states that in the state of Missouri, a law enforcement officer can shoot and kill a suspect who is fleeing if he has reason to believe that that suspect is dangerous and can harm others. So let me state that again. Section 563.046 is a statute in Missouri that states that a police officer can use deadly force, shoot and kill a fleeing suspect who is unarmed if they reasonably believe that that person is a danger to them or other people. There's only one problem with that. That statute had been defunct and overturned in the state of Missouri. It was no longer a current statute in the state of Missouri when the prosecutor handed that statute out to the grand jury. So she basically gave the grand jury a statute that had expired and was overturned in the Supreme Court in Missouri as being against a person's civil rights, no longer to be used in the state of Missouri. She gave them case law from 1985. Now she was the state attorney in 2014. How can you give someone, a grand jury group of people, instructions on the permissible force that police can use, knowing that that force that police can use that you're giving to these people on paper is overturned already and had been overturned and out of sync with current law enforcement practices in the area of Ferguson for close to 30 years. So Missouri Statute 563.046, very, very interesting statute. Let's see what some more interweb research says about it. It says that to understand the importance of the last minute clarification, we're going to go into the last minute clarification later on. To understand that in 1985, the US Supreme Court decision in Tennessee versus Garner. So basically, the United States Supreme Court decided in 1985 in the case of Tennessee versus Garner. Garner being a 15-year-old black boy, African-American boy in Memphis, Tennessee, i.e. Tennessee versus Garner, right? So the state of Tennessee versus Garner. 15-year-old boy shot and killed, shot in the back, fleeing a burglary, known to be unarmed, shot and killed in the back, or shot in the back and killed by a white police officer at the age of 15. The U.S. Supreme Court says enough is enough. This violates the Fourth Amendment right of anybody, and we cannot allow people to use deadly force, especially our law enforcement, when they know that the fleeing suspect is unarmed and not dangerous. And we don't care if they're fleeing a felony scene. What is that? Why is that important? Okay. Felony scene, meaning if you punch a police officer in the face, that's obviously felony assault on a law enforcement officer. But then if I turn around and run, you can't shoot me in the back because I'm fleeing a felony crime scene, but I am unarmed and no longer dangerous to you. So under the U.S. Supreme Court decision, 1985, Tennessee versus Garner, that police officer cannot pull out his gun because he feels bad that I punched him in his face and shoot me in the back because he knows that I'm unarmed. Because if he does that, that's going to violate my civil rights, my Fourth Amendment civil rights. And that was the law of the land since 1985. And it happened to be the law of the land that Missouri, they said, you know what? You guys are probably right about that. But what we're not going to do is we're not going to go into our state law and actually write that stuff down. We're going to observe your law because, as we know, federal Supreme Court law, that's why they call it the Supreme Court. It's the highest court in the land. You have to appeal and appeal and appeal and appeal until you get to the Supreme Court. Then they make a decision, and then all the courts that are under them now have to follow that decision. So Missouri's kind of pulled with all deliberate speed when it came to the 1985 ruling of Tennessee versus Garner. You know, they pulled well, let them come and enforce it. Yeah, the Supreme Court made a decision to uphold people's civil rights, especially if they're unarmed, even if they're fleeing a felony crime scene. If they're unarmed, police officers can't shoot them in the back. But what Alizadeh does is she hands them the very said piece of paper that says, prior to 1985, police officers could shoot you in the back if you were unarmed and fleeing the scene. And this being September 16th, 2014, you haven't even seen Darren Wilson yet, but we're going to decide whether or not he committed a crime based on this 30-year-old defunct law. So if you read this 30-year-old defunct law, put that in your mind, and then decide if Darren Wilson committed a crime when he shot and killed Mike Brown. And this is before Darren Wilson even testifies and does the whole, I felt like Hulk Hogan in the hands of, I felt like a boy in the hands of Hulk Hogan. So he wasn't even speaking for himself yet. The prosecutor was speaking for him now. She basically told the grand jury that according to law, now mind you, the grand jury is not lawyers, they're jurors. They're the same people that, I don't know if any of you have been to jury duty, but same group of citizens that go to do jury duty. And that's what comprises the grand jury. So these are not law professors. These are not people that peruse law books in their off time. So if a state prosecutor tells someone something, it's a trusted source. So if she tells me that the state law says that Darren Wilson can shoot and kill Mike Brown even though he's fleeing, then it's obvious that the man didn't commit a crime. Which is why we're here, what we're here to determine in the first place. Did he commit a crime? So where we are we getting that so far? We got a few people on, and I know I can ramble for a long time. So let's take that in. Do we take that in? Do we understand what I'm saying so far? Any comments, questions about what I'm saying about Tennessee versus Garner and the Missouri statute when it comes to what police officers use of deadly force, 563-046. Questions, comments? Are we still there? I still show some people on, so let's get some questions and comments. Adeja, I see you on. You probably driving. You probably in your commute. What you doing? What do we got? We got some angry faces. Is that an angry? Oh, that is an angry face. We got two angry faces. Questions or comments before I move on to what happens later on in the case. So I guess while we're waiting for questions and comments, again, I watched one of those videos on how to conduct a Facebook Live, and it says I'm supposed to be plugging why we're here. So obviously, time for another plug while we wait for questions and comments. Shaba Kojo, you can reach me at Shoolay.com. That's our website. Shoolay Inc. is the Facebook. Shoolay Inc. is the Instagram. Shoolay Inc. is the Twitter. Shoolay is the, what's the other one? Tumblr. I have a Tumblr too. We're on YouTube. Shoolay. That's SHOOLAY. Join our YouTube. We also have a podcast that we put out monthly, even though we're a little bit behind schedule right now. That podcast is the Kujenga podcast. Kujenga comes from the word build. So that's a Swahili word for build. Shoolay is also a Swahili word for school, if I can demystify that. But I spelt it differently than how you would spell Shoolay in Swahili. So I spelt it phonetically. But Kujenga podcast, that's KUJENGA podcast. So tune into that. That's monthly. You can go to our website. Information about the podcast is there. Go to our contact us section of the website. That's shoolay.com, SHOOLAY.com. Contact us to join our mailing list. The Kujenga podcast is on there. It's on one of the main menus. We have pics and vids from the events that we do with children as far as classes and things like that. So join our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/Shoolay Inc. Always, as always, join the Black Awakening movement. Stay tuned to all of our pages. Shout out to everybody that's doing the work, trying to educate children and trying to raise our status well, and doing the healing work. Rhonda does a lot of healing work with Lionheart. I don't know how much information she wants out there about that right now, but I guess she'll text me what she wants me to plug for her. Baba Khalil, who's also part of the Black Awakening movement. And Mama Cheryl, she's down here in the South Florida area, educating the children as well. So, keep doing the work. Keep going. Okay, great info. Keep going. Well, I got my marching orders, so I'm going to keep going. So September 16th happens. The state prosecutor says, use this 30-year-old defunct law to judge Darren Wilson with, because as you can see, according to this law, he didn't commit a crime. Darren Wilson then comes in, and mind you, this is report number, grand jury volume number 5, if you're into doing this. So you have to go through 5 volumes. And then something weird happens. They proceed for an entire 2 months. They go through all of September, or rather half of September, all of October, and darn near all of November. And they get down to November 21st. So this is at least a full 2 months after judging Darren Wilson through the lens of he had the right to gun down my crime. Quick pause break. I did ask Rhonda for something and she responded. Her website is lionheartlifehealing.com. All spelt normally. I know sometimes we spell things. So lion, heart, lifehealing.com, all spelled in English properly. No creative spellings. So back to what I was speaking about him. So that was September 14th when she gave them 30-year-old law that was no longer useful. And now we're 2 months and a week later, November 21st. So the entire, first of all, why does a grand jury take 2 months? That's beyond me. Because as I told you from the beginning, the grand jury was meant to curb the state prosecutor's ability to just charge everybody and anybody with cases in secret. But in this is a whole production. And it's dragged on for 2 months. So now we're in volume 24. So we went from volume 5, where she gives them garbage law, to volume 24. This is thousands of pages later. Thousands of words later. The grand jury has been with this case for the last 2 months, hearing from people for the defense, which is unheard of in a grand jury. And this is what happens on the 21st, 133 pages into the day of the 21st. So it's not even the beginning of the day. So we're 133 pages in of talking and commenting and instructions. And this is what Alizadeh says. The standard of proof is probable cause. We did confirm that. So apparently, a couple of thousand pages ago, they confirmed that there was probable cause for Darren Wilson to pursue Mike Brown. And the probable cause, as we know now, is the cigarellos, right? So it doesn't say what kind of probable cause, but we know what it is because we've been watching the whole thing, right? So apparently, they say they got Mike Brown on a videotape stealing some cigarellos and roughing some people up. People that know the real story know that either A, that might not have even been Mike Brown, and B, that's something that happened prior to the day of the shooting. And the person who reported that said that there was no issue, that, you know, this was a misunderstanding in the community and it's been sorted out. But they're still using that as probable cause. So even though this has been very long and arduous task, so, you know, Alizadeh is winding down now. You're not here to determine guilt or not guilty, as I stated from the beginning. That's not the responsibility of the grand jury. That's the responsibility of a court trial and a regular jury. So yeah, she rightly states that they're not there to determine guilt or innocence. Thank you for clearing that up for the grand jury. What they're there to determine is, was there probable cause for this to even be an issue? Is there enough probable cause? Do we see enough evidence here that says that Mike Brown committed a crime to even go to trial? So she's starting to explain to them on page 133 of the 24th volume why they're there. And it wasn't for the court case that they just witnessed. Right? So it says, now what makes this a little bit different is that if you look on the page, the first page, it talks about assault on a law enforcement in the first degree. And what's part of the indictment, because the officer saying he was arresting for assaulting him, not for the cigarettes, right? So Darren Wilson says, well, you know, I was in pursuit of a suspect who I was arresting, but then it became assault. So now the charge is increased to felony. Remember, felony assault on a police officer. So she's establishing that Darren Wilson had a right to be arresting Mike Brown. So what we're considering in this deliberation, if we've provided you with the definition of assault in the first degree and the second degree in assault in the second degree and the third degree, and then also a law enforcement officer's use of force in making an arrest. An officer can use force in making an arrest. Got that laid out for you. So she's covering her tracks now. So she's saying, we're here to determine if there was a first, second, or third degree felony that gave Darren Wilson the right to even be arresting Mike Brown. And then we know, because now we got hundreds of pictures from the hospital that show some bruising and scratching. So we've determined with the news media that Darren Wilson was beaten up. He's given his own testimony that he felt like a child in the hands of Hulk Hogan. Thank you for pointing out that there's a slight delay. No worries. I hope that everything is coming through clear. I don't have any indications that it's not. But then she says this. This is the state attorney. Real quick, can I interrupt about something? And then her co-worker says, sure. And then Alizadeh says, previously, in the very beginning, i.e. back in September 16, in the beginning of this process, I printed out a statute for you that was the statute in Missouri for the use of force to effect an arrest. So we know that statute. We have it by name, right? That's the statute that we spoke about is defunct. And she says, I not only told you what the statute was, I printed it out for you so that you could walk with it, so that you could read it, so that you could peruse it during this whole process. I printed it and I put it in your hands. Previously, that's what I did. I printed it out and I told you that this is what police officers were allowed to do. And of course, that statute said the police officer, if they felt that the person who was running from them, even though unarmed, was dangerous and they just committed a felony, you can shoot them and kill them. So that's the statute that she's talking about. She didn't mention it. She said, so if you all want to get those out, so wherever you put them, because apparently you have them, take them out. So the people have been walking with this statute for 2 months. Then she says this, what we have discovered, and we have been going along with doing our research, is that the statute in the state of Missouri does not comply with the case law. This law is codified in a written form in books, and they're called statutes, but courts interpret those statutes. And so the statutes for the use of force to effect an arrest in the state of Missouri does not comply with Missouri United States Supreme Court cases. And so what Sheila, who is her co-conspirator in this whole thing, has come up with is a statement of law as to when an officer can use force to effect an arrest that does not track our Missouri statute, but also takes into consideration what Supreme Court says. Okay? So the statute I gave you, if you want to fold that in half, just so you know, you don't necessarily rely on that, because there is a portion of that that doesn't comply with the law. And then the things that Sheila is giving you now, that statement about use of force to effect an arrest, I don't know. Is that what you called it? Is that the title? And then Sheila says, law enforcement officers' use of force in making an arrest. Yes. So Alizadeh then says, that does correctly state what the law is on what an officer can use force and when he can use deadly force in effecting an arrest. So this is where now she begins to start to stare these people. I don't want you to get confused. Don't rely on that copy or that printout of the statute that I've given you a long time ago, 2 months ago, that we've been judging this whole case by for 2 months. And then on page 135, she says, everything that we've been doing for the last 2 months was based on this statute. I don't want you to rely on that anymore. But she doesn't say it like that. She says, I don't want you to necessarily rely on this. And then her co-conspirator, Miss Worley, is looking at the faces of the grand juror, and they're obviously looking confused. So she says, do you have a question? And a grand juror says, so we're to disregard this? So obviously he has the statute that says, the 30-year-old defunct statute that says you can shoot people in the back when they're running away from you unarmed. And he says, we're supposed to disregard this? Because he's saying to himself, or she is saying to herself, it's a grand juror, it doesn't say male or female. But they're saying, we've been using this for the last 2 months. This is the lens that we've been trying to determine whether or not criminality occurred on the part of Darren Wilson. And according to this statute, no criminality has occurred because it says that Darren Wilson could do whatever he wants in shooting a fleeing suspect in the back, even though they're unarmed. And the grand juror says, we're supposed to disregard this? This is the answer. It's not entirely incorrect or inaccurate, but there is something in it that's not correct. Ignore it totally. She still doesn't clarify what's correct or incorrect about the 30-year-old defunct statute. But the grand jury is not finished. Is it because of the federal? Now, I don't know exactly if the grand jury is saying, is it because there was a federal law, or is it because of the federal investigation that's also occurring that's going to try to charge Darren Wilson with violating the civil rights? So the grand juror says, is it because of the federal? And she says, of a Supreme Court case, we must follow Supreme Court of the United States. It is Tennessee versus Garner. Not that that matters much to you. Now she gets condescending. And then the grand juror says, the Supreme Court, federal Supreme Court overrides Missouri statutes. And Alizade says, as far as you need to know, just don't worry about that. And the grand juror says, all right. I'm still like, this is the stuff. This is what's written down. It sounds confusing to me as I'm reading it because it was written with confusion going on in the room. So the grand jury says, all right. And she says, just disregard that statute. We don't want to get into a law class. Well, that's interesting because you're a lawyer, you're a prosecutor, this is probably the most important case that's come before your entire office in your career. But apparently she doesn't want to get into a law class. That's that one, and it's all that we want to say on that. So apparently she's done talking about the mistake that she made in handing them a 30-year-old statute. Yeah, I wanted to point that out. And then now her co-conspirator says, use of force in defense of a person. We've added use of force. It is actual. I'm sorry. We consider it self-defense instructions. So the first one is self-defense. So now she flips the whole thing. She says, take it out of the realm of what law enforcement is able to do. And let's just consider Darren Wilson's personal self-defense. So now this is a whole set of confusion that she's putting in on these people. She's like, so never mind. Let's worry about self-defense. And the first one we gave you, now she's saying that the first statute we gave you was about self-defense. So that's incorrect because that first statute was overruled by Tennessee versus Garner, what police are able to do with fleeing suspect. But now they put it back in the realm of self-defense as it relates to the information that you may have heard regarding Mike Brown. So she's saying the first one is self-defense as it relates to the information that you heard regarding Mike Brown. So she says the first statute that I gave you, which is wrong, is about self-defense as it relates to the issue regarding Mike Brown. So that's incorrect. The second one is self-defense as it relates to law enforcement officers. So she's saying, well, this one that we just gave you is self-defense as it relates to law enforcement officers. As you deliberate and looked at the indictment, if you have questions about the definitions, again, we have provided definitions, so just refer to that on the sheet you have. And then also probable cause is standard, but Kathy, something she added that I need to tell you, unless you want to do it. And then she says, I can do it. No, you do it. So this is a show, apparently. Now she's asking them to vote whether a true bill, whether you consider or you believe Darren Wilson committed a crime. Eventually she gets down and she says, but again, if you have additional questions, we're here. We're not going anywhere. Did you have something else? And the grand juror is so confused at this point that they say, no, I'm pretty much done. So they're pretty confused at this point because they've been going off of one thing for 2 months. Then they're told almost at the end that that thing that they were given is no longer usable. And then they're trying to get clarification. And the prosecutor is saying, don't worry too much about the law. We don't want to get into a law class right here. Just know that there are parts of that statute that I gave you that you've been judging this whole case by that are wrong. I'm not going to explain exactly which parts, but don't worry about that. Think about it as though the stuff that I gave you at the beginning was related to personal self-defense. And then the stuff that I'm giving you now relates to an officer's use of deadly force in self-defense. Again, changing the sentiment of the case from police to personal, from the burden that the police has on policing Black bodies to, well, how would you feel if you were a child in the hands of Hulk Hogan? Wouldn't you want to defend yourself? And what we're trying to determine here is whether or not Darren Wilson really committed a crime. That's what we're here to determine. We're not here to determine guilt or innocence, which she says later on. We're here to determine whether or not a crime was committed. So she says, it's not the kind of thing like a hung jury if we all can't agree on a charge. No. If there are 9 people who vote for indictment, regardless of what the charge you're indicting on, then know that there will be an indictment, and we will give you further instructions on what that indictment, that offense, it will be. And the one thing that Sheila has explained as far as what we find is kind of in Missouri, it is kind of the state has to prove in a criminal trial, the state has to prove that the person did not act in a lawful, and then she brings this up again, self-defense, or did not use lawful force in making. It is kind of like we have to prove the negative. Thoroughly, continually. Sitting in front of the grand jury, advocating that this thing is so confusing that we're not going to be able to prove guilt. But we can't even prove that a crime was committed based on the evidence that I gave you. That isn't right. What did you think the grand jury was going to come back and say? Well, they were going to come back and say exactly what they said. We can't find any evidence of a crime according to the proceedings that we just had. According to the proceedings that we just had, Darren Wilson was in fear for his life. And being in fear for his life, whether we're using past law or current law, well, he had a right to kill Mike Brown. Mumbo jumbo, that's right. 25 volumes, if you all want to read through that. I'm going to close the 25 volumes out now because I want to get to Tennessee versus Garner, or the way I want to say it is pre-Tennessee versus Garner, because we didn't answer the original question. I've been going on for almost an hour and a half now. And the original question was, why does this keep happening to us? And I have an answer. Why did we start with the Mason-Dixon line? Right? Maryland was considered a slaveholding state. Virginia was considered a slaveholding state. Right? Those would have been south of the Mason-Dixon line. The nation's capital during the time of the Civil War was sitting inside the border of two slaveholding states. So Washington, D.C. sits inside of Maryland and Virginia. It's not a state, it's this District of Columbia. But those territories, Maryland and Virginia, slaveholding states. Right? So the sentiment of the country, you're in the business, right? So the way my the way my internet is set up and the way I bookmark things is based on racism. So I go back and I bookmark things based on how it relates to the global problem we have of white supremacy, racism, or racism, white supremacy, one and the same. Excuse me. And I'll continue to quote Neely Fuller Jr. until you understand white supremacy, racism, what it is, and how it operates. Everything else that you think you understand would only serve to confuse you. And I even watched Rhonda give that quote. And that's something you should wake up in the morning reciting. It's something that you should recite every day until you understand the system of white supremacy, racism, what it is and how it operates. Everything else that you think you understand would only serve to confuse you. So let's answer the question of, why does this keep happening to us? Why is it that police are able to murder us and then walk away unscathed? Why would such an important proceeding, such as the Ferguson grand jury, be botched by what can only be called a bias prosecutor? It has to do with sentiment. And it has to do with the sentiment that started at the foundations of this country. These are slavery laws, right? Paul Mooney says it best. He says, he read the white people's book, and us getting away wasn't a chapter, and they still haven't gotten over it. 1672, Virginia state law, which isn't much different from Missouri state law that would come later. It becomes legal to wound or kill an enslaved person who resists arrest. Let me say that again. 1672, and it hasn't changed since then. It becomes legal to wound or kill an enslaved person who resists arrest. Legislators also deem that the owner of any slave killed as he is resisted arrest will receive financial compensation for the loss of an enslaved laborer. Legislators, by the way, 1672, they were still fighting the Native Americans, also offer rewards to Native Americans who capture enslaved, or rather escaped enslaved people, and return them to the justice of the peace. So if you don't go back and check sentiment, if you don't go back and check origins, if you don't know the history, you keep asking the same question. So if you don't understand, and by the way, this is just Virginia law as America is becoming a country. Obviously, 1672, this is before the Revolutionary War, right? This is before America is even a country. This is just the colony of Virginia. they've already established the slave code. And it's already, before America became America, it was legal to wound or kill an enslaved person who resists arrest. And the owner would be compensated. So what happens now? We get into a discussion with police. They put on their lens of, well, who am I speaking to here? Am I speaking to an American, i.e. a person who's classified as white, or am I speaking to an African American, i.e. formerly straight up enslaved person? Well, if this straight up enslaved person or formerly enslaved person tries to resist me, it becomes illegal for them to do so, and it becomes legal for me to kill or wound them. And this makes its way into the conversation way down into 2019. Well, just stop resisting, right? Well, that doesn't do anything to change the sentiment. Another quote from Baba Khalil. I'll try to read that quote later on from Chancellor Williams. I believe that comes out of Destruction of Black Civilization. Close to the end of the book, so you have to you have to get all the way down to the end of the book to even get that quote. So you gotta read. You gotta keep reading. So that's 1672. So has anything changed since 1672? Or is this the same sentiment that was south of the Mason-Dixon line, even north of the Mason-Dixon line? Because slave catchers would go up there and pick any black body and say, you know what, you look like an escaped enslaved person. You're going back. And if you don't think it's important that the capital was moved from Pennsylvania, which would have been a free, so-called free state, to Maryland, Virginia area, what they call the DMV area, which was slave territory. If you've ever watched 12 Years a Slave, I know I have. But the victim, I believe Solomon is the first name. The last name escapes me right now. He was stolen from DC. So apparently there was a special demarcation line in DC that if you were north of that demarcation line, Maryland, which is a slaveholding state, you would be considered free. But if you went south of that line in DC, then you were really, really screwed. And how do we know that Maryland and Virginia were slaveholding states? Well, because the White House was built by slaves. And you're not going to export slaves from slave states to free states to have them do work. So as they're building the nation's capital, the sentiment on the ground is business is booming, and the business is slavery. And the Virginia law from 1672, prior to America being America, said it's legal to wound or kill an enslaved person who resists arrest. Now, what are you going to arrest them for? What are you arresting an enslaved person for in 1672? Right? Trying to get away from you, right? Armed or unarmed. So, did America correct itself? No. It went deeper down the rabbit hole. And let me pull up. Let me pull up some more stuff on racism, white supremacy, and sentiment during that time. 1669, it's a couple of years later, they decide we need to ramp up our ability to wound or kill enslaved people
that resist arrest. We need to broaden the scope as to how we can treat them. And we're going to call that the Casual Killing Act of 1669, where it was declared legal to kill a slave while correcting them, because malice could not be presumed. That's so you go from you can kill a slave who is resisting arrest, and you forward the narrative not in the direction of human rights, but away from the direction of human rights. And you start to say stuff like, well, now we can have the Casual Killing Act. I'm sorry, 1669, 1672. Okay, so the Casual Killing Act came first. Let me reorganize those. So the Casual Killing Act says it's legal to kill a slave while correcting them, because you can't presume that the person that's correcting them, that's beating them with the whip or with the board or with the branding iron, you can't assume that they're doing it with malice. So therefore, it can't be murder. Let's read some of this funny dirty stuff. It says, whereas the only law in force for the punishment of refractory servants resisting their master, mistress, or overseer cannot be inflicted upon Negroes, nor the obstinacy of many of them by other than violent means suppressed. Be it enacted and declared by this grand assembly, that's a group of white people that got together in Virginia, if any slave resists his master or others by his master's order in correcting him, so basically any white person, or any white person that says that they come on the authority of the white person that owns you, and by the extremity of the correction should chance to die, that his death shall not be considered a felony, but the master, or that other person appointed by the master to punish him, be acquitted from molestation, since it cannot be presumed that malice existed, which alone makes murder a felony. So, you know, the thing is, whether or not you believe what white people write down, they believe it. And not only do they believe it, but they codified it and they live by it. The legal system in America is nothing more than a group of, at that time, white men who got together and said, we'd like to see our young country run a certain way. So let's make up some stuff. And we'll, you know, we'll word it in a way to make it fit how we want it to be. So they're saying in the Casual Killing Act of 1669 that the only way to correct enslaved Negroes is to beat them. And since that is what we have to do, then we need to make it okay that if we beat them to death, that we are not breaking any of our laws. Because we can't presume that we did it with malice. So because there's no malice, then it's not murder. So we're going to acquit ourselves of molestation. And that's the sentiment of law enforcement. I don't know if there are other sentiments that law enforcement has, then let's speak about it. But it's sentiment. And sentiment is based on culture, and culture is based on history. So if you try to remove history, culture, sentiment, the idea of racism, white supremacy from the conversation when you're speaking about why we keep seeing ourselves gunned down on the interwebs, on our YouTubes, on our Facebooks. And the sentiment is, well, if they would have only listened, if they only didn't, get smart at the mouth, if they didn't run, if they didn't resist. Well, the reason that they're saying, well, that the sentiment is like that is because we know that on paper, whether or not the Supreme Court recently says, well, you can't do that anymore, we know what the sentiment is. And we know what's happening behind the closed doors of grand juries, that they're still going off of that sentiment when they're deciding not to charge these police officers with crimes. Unless I'm seeing it incorrectly. And by the way, I'm being facetious when I say that, because that's my answer to the question of why it keeps happening. It keeps happening because of sentiment based on history and culture. And that history is one of enslavement of African people. And the right of anyone sent by the authority of those who call themselves masters, i.e. the state or the government or law enforcement officials. And the sentiment of that is, well, you can't resist those people, because if you do, they have the right to kill you. And all they have to do is prove that you resisted, and then you don't even have to be armed anymore. And then all we have to do is prove that there was no malice. That's an interesting word, malice. Because as we round the corner here, as we're about to wrap up, let's speak about that word malice. Because it was that same word that was used to prosecute Charleston, South Carolina, Michael Slade. And you remember, he's the one that shot Walter Scott in the back. And listen to the judge's decision. U.S. District Judge David Norton, in issuing the sentence, said Slager shot Scott with malice and recklessness. Why was it important to put that word in there? Because of sentiment. Because that very word, malice, is the legal term used in determining whether white people are going to excuse themselves for killing us or not. Malice. And why did they determine that Walter Scott was shot and killed in malice? And everyone saw that video too. Well, he would have got the same sweetheart deal that Darren Wilson got except for one thing. He outright lied on the police report. One, he tried to plant a taser on Walter Scott too. But three, and most important, he didn't know the incident was being videotaped. So it was going to be his word against a dead man's word until the video surfaced. And the video surfaced after he had given his official account, which would have been the account that they would have been able to use in a grand jury to determine that there was no malice. But then the video comes after he was already knee deep in his own lie. And they couldn't pull him out. The paperwork had already, and remember, once you start writing it down, because he started writing down a bunch of stuff. Well, Walter Scott did this, and Walter Scott did that, and then Walter Scott scuffled with me, and then Walter Scott tried to grab my gun, and then you know, we fought. But then the video showed a completely different story, one angle, very plainly and simply what happened, and then it showed him walk over to Walter Scott's body and throw his taser on him. And it says, wait a minute, Mike, we can't give you the same sweetheart deal that we gave Darren Wilson, because you started writing the stuff and you didn't know the video existed, and then the video came out and it went viral. But your testimony is already circulating and the video and the testimony don't match. Daggone it. What are we gonna do, Mike? Well, all right, this is what's gonna happen, Mike. You're gonna have to go to the same jail. We're gonna hold you there for a little while. By the way, Dylan Roof, he's your neighbor at the jail, because that's not so you're not gonna be cellmates, but he's gonna be next. He's gonna be in the next building or wherever y'all are being held. You're gonna have to sit there for a little while. This is how it's gonna play out, because we can't fully save you, but what we can do is this. They're gonna have a trial. They're gonna have a local trial for you, a state trial. And we're gonna stack. We're gonna make sure that that jury, we got some of our people on. So that jury is gonna get hung, which it did. The jury got hung. And then he got the sweetheart deal of a lifetime. The feds came in and says, we can charge you with a civil rights violation. And if you agree to plead guilty to the civil rights violation, we'll drop the state. Why would you want to go federal instead of state? Well, you want to go federal because you want your case to go to a place that you can cut a deal and get the best sweetheart deal that you can get. So what ended up happening? They dropped the state case. He pled guilty to the federal case. And then he got to go to prison in Colorado, to a place named Englewood, which Forbes magazine rated one of the best places to go to prison in America. He went to a prison that was rated higher than the prison that Martha Stewart went to. This is what we're speaking about, sentiment. So, caught red-handed in a lie. The same verbiage that was used to acquit people that would, or rather to acquit white people that would beat black people to death, that same word malice was used to convict him because he got caught in his own lie. But he still got a backdoor deal. And he got to go to one of the sweetest prisons in America. He got to go to one of them prisons that the Enron people went to. As a matter of fact, Jared from Subways is over there. So him and the Subways guy is probably best buds right now. In a prison that Forbes magazine, Forbes is a financial magazine, they started a list of top places to go to prison. And his prison is rated, I think, in the world, there's like top 50. Martha Stewart went to like number 48 because, America doesn't, when you look on the world stage of things, you start looking at statistics, you'll find out America isn't as much a world leader in things as we want America to be. So apparently there are top 50 prisons in the world, and America is even down at the bottom. Not that they have some number 3s and 4s up there. Martha Stewart was in like 48, and old Mike Slager is in number 47 with Enron guys and city officials and the Subways guy. And his number one complaint is that he's too far from his family. And it all has to do with sentiment. And it's going to keep happening. And it's not going to change. Because if they're still using verbiage from the 1600s, malice, if they're still using the sentiment from the 1600s, if a person should die while under correction, or it's legal to harm and kill a person that's resisting arrest, and the sentiment is the same back then and it is now, then when is it going to change? So we, as the victims of this, are going to have to change the narrative. So it's 57 past. I understand that the video might be a little delayed. But if there's any questions or final comments, and I see here, let me read let me read Baba Khalil's Chancellor Williams quote. And again, this is from the book The Destruction of Black Civilization. It's one of the first books that I read on my journey to of, or rather to decoding racism, white supremacy, so I can get my right mind back, so that I'm not confused about anything. And Chancellor Williams is the author of the book. I think the foreword is written by Dr. John Henrik Clarke. It says, "The whites are the implacable foe, the traditional and everlasting enemy of the blacks. The compelling reason for publicly putting this declaration in its historical context is clear. The necessary re-education of blacks and the possible solution of racial crisis can begin, strangely enough, only when blacks fully realize this central fact in their lives. The white man is their bitter enemy. For this is not the ranting of a wild-eyed militancy, or rather of wild-eyed militancy, but the calm and unmistakable verdict of several thousand years of documented history." Chancellor Williams. Well, I could hear the wheels turning right now. Are all white people this? Are all white people that? Well, what you have to do is look at sentiment and beliefs. and history and culture. And what Chancellor Williams is speaking about here is when you study our history from 3500 BCE or 3200 BCE, when Minis unified Kemet, upper and lower, till today, any group of people that classified themselves as non-African that would come into Africa to try to rule Kemet, particularly at that point, would create a color grading system where the lightest, whitest people ended up on the top of society and the darkest, blackest people ended up on the bottom of society. This was an observation in Kemet at 3200 BCE, when you had what they called Hyksos coming into, or foreign rulers coming in from whether the Mediterranean or the Arabian Peninsula to rule. A form of not codified racism that we have today, but the beginnings of colorization. Anyway, 9:01. I'm going to leave this one here. Let's start the conversation, and hopefully we can do this again in the future. So thank you all for tuning in. Shoolay.com. Please go. Please follow our Facebook. Please head to our website. Black Awakening Movement, as always, going to be here every week presenting information for you to clear up confusion in your own minds about white supremacy, racism. So let's continue the conversation. Let's continue the conversation offline, online, in the line, in person. Let's keep doing it. And, hopefully we can do another discussion like this with Black Awakening Movement and as many groups as we want involved. Let's get everyone involved in these conversations. So Shaba Kojo, hashtag Ask Shaba Kojo if you have questions, and I'll be responding with short video answers. I've started that series again. And sorry, got to show you the do-rag again. We're out of St. Louis mode. We're back to the Make Al Kebelon great again. Go ahead and order these. I'm getting the final pricing down. This is the Next Era 5950s, but you can also get the off-brand hats for a little bit less. They're gonna be, in the mid-30s for the new era, and for the off-brand, I think we can start right around that 30 range. And then look out for the shirts coming soon. I'm still picking the t-shirts out. So I'm signing off. Thank you, Black Awakening Movement. Thank you for everyone that joined. Shoolay Shaba Kojo signing off.